What is up, scribblers? Today we're doing one more addition to the art history series, and we are going to be talking about Delacroix. So Delacroix is an artist and critic that has strong opinions as to what makes art successful and unsuccessful. He is a strong proponent of the use of imagination in artwork, and thus he has strong opinions against one-to-one translation between art and life. He argues that art should have a certain warmness to it that is created with the help of imagination, symbolism, fantastical colors, and a sense of energy that the artist adds to their respective works. In order to really understand the type of critic that Delacroix is, we can look at how he would critique different works of art. So Delacroix would look at a piece like the Portrait of a Man in a Costume by Jean-Henri Fragonard as a realistic and centered stylized caricature. Now, Delacroix would specifically be looking at the type of color being used, the stylization being applied to the painting, and the brushwork. He would identify the colors to be semi-realistic, except for the contrast between the face and the clothing. This is similar to the analysis discussed in the previous video. Delacroix might not be a big fan of the colors due to the fact that they seem to be too realistic, and the clothing blends too much with the background. This is in contrast to the previous analysis I had done, in which I felt the dullness of the color made the face pop out at you. Delacroix's critique in this case would diverge from my analysis. Delacroix would feel that the composition of the painting is a bit plain, due to the fact that the composition doesn't challenge the audience to think about the painting in a deeper way, except for the idea that the audience would focus on the facial expression of the man. In this way, this art critique might find the mystery of the facial expression as something that adds to the warmth of the painting. Delacroix might not put as much emphasis to analyzing how the arm leads to the audience's eyes to dart to the face of the character, as stated in my previous analysis, and yet he might see the facial expression as something that the audience might think deeply about and be significant in the painting. In many ways, Delacroix's critique would match the analysis of the mystery of the facial expression as talked about in the previous video. The added stylization of the brushwork would be something that Delacroix would be looking for in a painting like this. Delacroix would pay close attention to the way the brushwork is applied and the sense that the man looks more fantastical than realistic, which matches my argument. Delacroix would specifically identify the big shapes for the red blush of the man and the sharp quality of the ear. In this way, Delacroix's critique would match exactly to the analysis that I made. In the piece Period by Jean-Antoine Watteau, Delacroix would identify the representation as a bland in color, yet fantastical in detail and proportions. Delacroix would pay close attention to the amount of detail in the piece and whether it leads more towards imagination or realism. On the other hand, there's a use of creating a fantastical character like the Period, which is a ridiculous character in the center of the painting. However, the color seems to be too realistic and thus adds a sense of coldness to the painting. In this way, Delacroix would diverge from my analysis since he views reality being depicted one-to-one in art as a bad thing. However, Delacroix would agree with me in the sense that the brushwork and detail in the piece supersedes reality, and thus there's a sense of warmth in his painting. More specifically, Delacroix would be looking at the folds in the clothing of the central character. He would also be thinking about whether the Period in the painting is actually in the scene or just the imagination of the background characters. Thus, Delacroix's critique would add to my analysis. The proportions of the clown would be viewed by Delacroix as fantastical and over the top. This matches my arguments about the painting. The expressions of the characters are also something Delacroix would pay close attention to, and more specifically, the mystery of what the characters are thinking. This would absolutely add to my analysis of the painting, with the only difference being that Delacroix would not be a fan of the realistic rendering and colors of the painting. In Lebrun's Physiognomic Drawings by Charles Lebrun, Delacroix would see the piece as an imaginative and simplified view of the ridiculousness of the human and owl forms. Delacroix would look at the simplified black and white nature of the illustration as a way of straying away from reality and diving into the imagination of the artist. This would be a big plus for Delacroix as a viewer. He would add onto the argument of the piece being simplified representation of human and animalistic forms that convey the imagination of the artist. Delacroix would pay close attention to the proportions and would see, as I have previously identified, that the piece is an unserious and comedic in nature. Delacroix would see the evidence to this in the way that the human head looks similar to the features of the owl. He would view the use of proportions and would add to the critique that I made about this artwork. Delacroix wouldn't find the composition as significant as I found it in my analysis. This is because the composition isn't trying to pose any specific questions and is just a way to view the heads in the illustration. This means Delacroix wouldn't even add on to the arguments I made in my observation of this artwork. In the painting Phoebus Apollo by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, Delacroix would examine and determine the piece as an imaginative and realistic piece of grand fiction. Delacroix would look at the use of composition and storytelling as a masterful way of Battista showcasing his imagination onto canvas. The use of many different visual elements being composed to create a sense of action would be pleasing to Delacroix. Delacroix would add to the analysis of the painting because he would see the composition as a window into the mind and creativity of Battista. The brushwork of this piece is something Delacroix would pay attention to. Like in my previous analysis, Delacroix would respect the artist's method of trying to create dynamism with the brushstrokes and yet having a human quality to the painting with the rough brushstrokes for the clouds. However, Delacroix might not be a big fan of the realistic skin tones that I've analyzed in this piece. The contrast between rough and smooth brushstrokes might be something that Delacroix would add onto my criticism of the artwork. Delacroix would appreciate the use of lighting in this piece. He would see the use of exaggerated contrast between light and dark values as a way to tell a dramatic story in the painting and to transport the viewers into the world of the painting. He would see the warmth of the painting with the grand nature of the values being represented, and in this instance, Delacroix would add on to my criticism when it comes to the lighting of the painting. In the piece Masquerade by Claude Guillot, Delacroix would identify the illustration as a fantastical and mysterious scene. The line work in this piece is something Delacroix would pay close attention to, due to the fact that the illustration isn't a painting and relies heavily on line work to convey the characters. Delacroix would find that the piece is more fantastical look into another world rather than representing reality. The line work and hatching would also make the piece detailed without being a one-to-one copy of real life. Delacroix would add on to my critique about how the line work makes the artwork more complex and fantastical. The details in the clothing would also be something Delacroix would pay massive attention to. With the folds being more exaggerated, Delacroix would find that Guillot is creating a sense of realism in the world of the painting. With the exaggeration comes a sense of fantasy in the illustration, meaning Delacroix would add on to my critique and would view the details in the painting as being successful. Finally, Delacroix would pay close attention to the expression of the characters and how their expressions create a sense of mystery in this illustration. Delacroix appreciates when paintings add a sense of mystery, and this means it's not just a pure imitation of reality. Delacroix would add on to my previous critique with the idea that the mystery in the characters' emotions make the study of the scene more than just an imitation of reality. In the painting Burial at the Ornans, Courbet puts his focus on the formal elements of the painting to make sure that he can convey the people and the sense of monumentality that is brought out in the theme of the painting. In the composition, there is a massive blank space, which is similar to pieces like Lebrun's physiognomic drawings and Fragonard's painting Portrait of a Man in a Costume. There's also this stubbornness in the painting as Courbet draws the audience into the drama and emotion of the piece, even when it's deadpan. There's also use of realism when it comes to portraying the skin tones, similar to pieces like Periot and Phoebus Apollo. The mystery of the facial expressions of the people in the painting is similar to that presented in the illustration Masquerade by Guillot. The social context of the piece is simply to be an example of realism and showcase the experiences that Courbet might have gone through while living in a small towns like Ornans. This sense of realism is similar to what other artists have accomplished in pieces like Portrait of a Man in the Costume and Période. However, these other pieces add a sense of fantasy in how they depict its characters, and that is not necessarily present at The Burial at Ornans. The political context to this piece is explored through the fact that Courbet paints the ordinary people and showcases the power that they have. This message was emphasized by the revolutions and movements that were happening during this time. This differs from the 5 other pieces discussed, as the other 5 pieces are meant to simply portray life without adding an underlying theme of revolution. In the cultural context, The Burial at Ornans painting differed from the type of work showcased at the Salon, as it challenged the norms during this time. While people painted in realism, they weren't necessarily trying to showcase a message, unless the artist was Courbet. This cultural context differs from the 5 other artists, and the artworks are only meant to challenge the imagination of the viewers and not necessarily challenge the cultural norms during this time. The 5 other paintings were more of a celebration of how life was rather than how the artist's life wanted to be. The historical context of this time is that of an uneasy public that has had enough with politicians. There is a sense of challenge of authority that is seen with The Burial at Ornans. However, this differed from the cultural context of the 5 other paintings. The main challenge of paintings like Lebrun's physiognomic drawings, Phoebus Apollo, and Période were to poke fun at the imagination of artists and to challenge the notion that art needs to be serious and realistic in nature. This differed from Courbet's time of turmoil and pressure to change the system. Thank you guys again for watching. I really hope to do videos like this again, or maybe even commenting on our present time animators and seeing how they differ from the artists during ancient times. If you haven't already, please hit that like button, share it if you want, and hit subscribe.